I think it's fair to say that Hegel suffers from misinterpretation more than almost any other thinker. And I think part of that is because he's just a bad writer, but I don't think you can chalk up all of it to bad writing. I think part of it is, the major part of it is that he wrote prior to the existence of psychoanalysis. And my wager is that psychoanalysis, if he had had the concepts of psychoanalysis and the terminology, he would have been able to be much clearer about what he's trying to say. And I think readers would have been it would have been much easier for them to understand what he's trying to say because of specifically one major concept, that is the unconscious. That the unconscious, it signifies that we are all the time at odds with ourself or in contradiction with ourself. That is, that we have a conscious wish, our conscious will, and it's all the time being undermined by our unconscious desire. So this is the contradiction of subjectivity. We consciously will one thing, our unconscious desire undermines that with something else. Like, I might consciously will, I've just got out of a bad relationship, I consciously will that my next partner will be different than my last one. But because I'm driven by unconscious desire rather than just conscious will, I end up unconsciously picking out someone who repeats exactly the same kind of terrible things that my previous partner did, and I'm stuck back in the same relationship. So that's what Freud called repetition compulsion, but it's also a way of thinking about the contradiction of subjectivity. So I think that's one key way in which Freud and psychoanalysis would help Hegel to make clearer or how contradiction affects subjectivity. I think it's also, because I think of this, Hegel's, he probably didn't say this, but his purported last line is, only one man understood me, and then he waits for a minute and he says, and even he didn't understand me, and then he died. So that's a pretty great line, but I think, what if it's true that Hegel was actually thinking about himself, and he didn't fully understand himself, that he was writing something beyond what he himself was capable of getting? And I think one way to think about that is to think, if he didn't have the full conceptual apparatus for making sense to himself of what he wanted to say. And I think Freud psychoanalysis would provide that. So I think the key psychoanalytic concept for making sense of Hegel is that of the death drive. And death drive for Freud doesn't mean drive to death, even though that's apparently what it says. Instead, it means that we're constantly undermining ourselves, fomenting loss, and that we enjoy the repetition of failure and loss. And that's Freudian death drive. And that's Freud's way of conceiving the contradiction of subjectivity, I think. So one way that death drive manifests itself quite a bit is in the Freudian slip, I think. So there's a nice, and I think there's a nice example of the Freudian slip. So two women are having lunch with each other, and one says to the other, you know, I had this terrible Freudian slip yesterday. And the other one says, what was that? And she's like, well, I meant to tell my husband that I found a rock on a hike. And I told him, I said, look, I was on this hike yesterday and I discovered a new cock to add to my collection. And the other woman's like, you know what? I had the same thing happen to me this morning at breakfast. I was talking to my husband and I said, I wanted to say, pass the orange juice. Instead, I said, you ruined my life, asshole. So, of course, the second isn't a slip at all, but it nicely captures, I think, the way that a Freudian slip functions. That is, it allows us to articulate the self-destructive, death drive, unconscious desire that we otherwise wouldn't be able to articulate. In fact, because it's strange to ourselves. And I think that's for me, that's a nice example of the way contradiction works, and one of the ways in which Hegel can't think it, and yet that's, I think, key to his philosophy, like that idea of the slip, where language says more than we consciously intend. That's all the time there in Hegel's philosophy, and yet it's Freud's notion of the slip that really makes that concrete and makes it clear what Hegel means by that. It'd be very nice if we could look to Freud himself for his reading of Hegel, but unfortunately he only mentions Hegel 2 times, and both dismissively and in footnotes. So there's no, as far as one could deduce, he really probably did not read Hegel. And But there's another psychoanalytic thinker who actually talks about Hegel quite a bit, that's Jacques Lacan. But unfortunately, the times when Lacan says, this is where I'm being Hegelian, and this is more early in his thought, early in his career, those are times when he's relying on the reading of Hegel forwarded by one of Lacan's own master's teachers, Alexander Kojève. And Kojève's reading of Hegel is very particular and it's interesting, but it misses a lot, and that's what Lacan is focused on. So it's more when Lacan thinks he's departing from Hegel that he actually becomes more Hegelian. And I'm not the first person to say this. Mladen Dolar, I think, was the first person to say it. But I find that pretty fascinating, that if you want to look for traces of Hegel in psychoanalysis, you have to look at the points in which Lacan says, here I'm departing from Hegel, and then you'll have it. To say that the absolute is a reconciliation with contradiction means that we have to, in some way, integrate our relationship to the obstacle to our satisfaction into our way of thinking about satisfaction. And I think Freud does that better than anyone, because the end of psychoanalysis is really not allowing you to realize your desire, but allowing you to realize that the thing that you took as an obstacle to your desire is actually central to your desire and not something you can just cast aside and get to the final end point. And he has a great line at the end of this, the last line of Studies on Hysteria, when he says the point of psychoanalysis is actually translating hysterical misery into common human unhappiness. And so I like that idea that the end point of Hegel's philosophy as well is one of common human unhappiness. And I think there's a nice filmic example of this, the film Heat, directed by Michael Mann. It's a phenomenal film. It's a heist film with a gang of thieves who they perpetuate a more or less successful robbery. Two of them are killed, but the two that live, they're successful, and one escapes, and the other one, the leader of the gang, who's Neil McCauley, played by Robert De Niro, is ready to escape to Fiji. That's his dream, to go to Fiji, with his girlfriend. And so he's driving, everything's set up. He's driving to the airport. He's on the way. He's got a private plane waiting to take him to Fiji. It's paid for. He's got all the money. Everything's fine. And so he's about to realize his conscious wish. But then he gets a phone call from one of his accomplices who says to him, the guy that you were looking for that had earlier been part of their gang, or kind of been a kind of on loan part of their gang, who had sabotaged one of their earlier jobs and that De Niro wanted to kill. His accomplice says, he's at this.
It's me.
Plane's in the air now. Be right on time. On the driver's end, I still can't find nobody, so that's in the trust. One other thing. You asked, so I gotta tell you. Guy you wanted checked into the hotel marquee under Jameson, if you still give a shit. Which I figured you wouldn't.
You figured right.
So long, brother. You take it easy. You're home free.
Take it easy.
So De Niro comes to this point as he's driving down the road where he could go straight to the airport and go to Fiji with his girlfriend with millions of dollars, or he could veer off and go to the hotel and kill this guy he wants to kill. Obviously, he follows his drive, he follows his unconscious, he actually successfully kills the guy at the hotel, unfortunately ends up getting himself killed in the process. So he doesn't escape to Fiji, he destroys himself. So for me, that's what De Niro, maybe as he was dying there, or Neil McCauley, as he was dying, what he experienced was absolute knowledge that I brought this destruction on myself. And that the obstacle, and if he could have, I don't think psychoanalysis or Hegel would help him escape to Fiji. It would maybe help him not rob banks in the first place. Not that it's a moralizing kind of philosophy, but the idea of the heist is that you can get away with something and then realize your desire and then everything will be fine. But the point of psychoanalysis, I think, and the point of Hegel is that it's the obstacle that's crucial. And so you're recognizing how the obstacle isn't something to get rid of, but something to embrace and see as essential to you.